Hello student, I am Professor Smita Jha and I am here to discuss Hard Time, especially the background of the novel during the Victorian age. So let us see the background and its characteristics of the Victorian era. So Charles Dickens, one of the primary figures of Victorian literature, was born on February 7, 1812 to John and Elizabeth Barrow Dickens in Portsmouth. John Dickens was a clerk in the Naval Pay Office, a job that took him and his family to London in 1814, to Chatham in 1817, and back to London in 1822. In Chatham, the young Charles Dickens spent the happiest years of his childhood days. He loved the sights and sounds of the busy shipbuilding centers, and both his parents encouraged his early devotion to such 18th century prose masters as Henry Fielding, Oliver Goldsmith, and Tobias Smollett. But his father's inability to live within his means, coupled with the growth of the Dickens household, brought an early end to his happiness that coincided with the family's second move to London. Just 2 days past his 12th birthday, Dickens was sent to work in a warehouse pasting labels on the shoe blacking pots to supplement the family income. 11 days later, his father was arrested for debt and was taken to the Marshalsea debtors' prison. The double blow of his family's fall from fortune and his own banishment into drudgery and humiliation constituted an abrupt loss of innocence whose ache never fully subsided. Although a bequest freed his father from the Marshalsea after 3 months and Dickens' own warehouse tenure lasted only for the sense of insecurity and injustice these events instilled lasted a lifetime. At the same time, the experience benefited the future writer, broadening his scope, deepening his insight, and contributing to the astonishing energy and resolve with which he subsequently pursued his vocation. Less than a month after his father removed him from the blacking warehouse, Dickens was enrolled as a day student at the Wellington House Academy in London. Here, between the ages of 12 to 15, he was already trying his hand at the kind of writing that would launch him on his professional career. He submitted what was called penny a line stuff to his father's employer, the British Press information about fires, accidents, or police reports missed by the regular reporters. Several years later, constrained by his work as a clerk in a law office, he set himself the difficult task of mastering shorthand so as to return to journalism in earnest. In 1828, during his 16th year, he became a freelance reporter in the London law courts. For several years, he alternated reporting, exploring the London streets, and reading avidly at the British Museum. Dickens's experiences as a young boy trying to make his way alone in London, his encounters with the harsh conditions of factories and prisons, and his resentment of a system that kept the poor in poverty came to inform many of his novels. Loss of childhood innocence and exploitation of the vulnerable are two themes explored in his works, taking central roles in the Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, David Copperfield, Hard Time, and Great Expectation. Dickens sold his first short story in 1833 to the monthly magazine. The following year, he began working for the Morning Chronicles, writing stories under the name Boz. These stories were published in the collection Sketches by Bloss in 1836. In the same year, Dickens began editing for Bentley's Miscellany. In this publication, his first two novels, The Pickwick Papers and Oliver Twist, appeared in the serial form. He continued working at the intense pace for several years. As his catalogue of novels grew, so did his popularity and his fortune. By 1843, when he published A Christmas Carol, the first and most successful of his 4 Christmas books, Dickens was already a household name in London. Later in his career, Dickens founded and edited two successful weekly magazines, Household Words and All the Year Round, through which he serialized several of his later novels. In 1836, Dickens married Catherine Hogarth, with whom he had 10 children. In the early years of his marriage and career, Dickens enjoyed fatherhood and domestic pursuit. His writing earned him sufficient money to support his family and helped settle his parents' debt, but the marriage was ultimately unhappy. The couple separated in 1858, a year after Dickens fell in love with actress Ellen Ternan. Dickens seems to have had a happy relationship with Ternan, but he treated Catherine Dickens poorly. He even accused her of being mentally ill and claimed she and their children were happier apart from one another. One of his daughters later said Dickens ceased to care about his children after the breakup with their mother. In this way, Dickens's treatment of divorce in Hard Times presents it as a natural solution to deeply unhappy marriages. Stephen Blackpool in the novel seeks a divorce from his alcoholic and abusive wife so he can marry a more agreeable woman. Lucia Gradgrind leaves Mr. Bounderby after an emotional breakdown. It is possible these scenes reflect Dickens's own frustration at being trapped in his marriage, as an English divorce before 1857 required parliamentary approval and cost a small fortune. Charles Dickens' novels remained highly popular throughout his lifetime, but his popularity began to decline after his death. Early 20th century critics praised serious novels by modernist authors such as James Joyce and Virginia Woolf, and by comparison found Dickens's novels shallow and carelessly constructed. The 1940s, however, saw a revival of critical interest and appreciation for Dickens's ability to combine compelling stories with significant social criticism. The English writer and satirist George Orwell commented on Dickens's work in 1940. In Oliver Twist, Hard Times, Bleak House, Little Dorrit, Dickens attacked English institutions with a ferocity that has never since been approached. Yet, he managed to do it without making himself hated. And more than this, the very people he attacked have shallowed him so completely that he has become a national institution himself. Already devoted to the essays of Joseph Addison, Oliver Goldsmith, and Samuel Johnson, he now read the major 19th century essayists Leigh Hunt, William Hazlitt, Charles Lamb, Walter Savage Landor, and Thomas De Quincey. Dickens wrote Hard Times in 1854, in the middle of a century and an era that prided itself on its social, economic, and scientific achievements. Dickens was one of the most famous and successful writers in 19th century England. Along with 14 novels, many of them rich in topical allusion, he produced a body of work as reporter, essayist, correspondent, and editor that constitutes a lifelong account of the facts of Victorian life as he knew them. Dickens was a lover of facts in his work as a reporter, but his non-fiction work is anything but a mere collection of data. In his reporting and commentary, Dickens is often an outraged reformer, uncompromising in his attacks on privileged interest. In the earliest sketches, he is a writer trying to achieve a synthesis of art and social criticism. The surviving letters, some 14,500 of which the editors of the ongoing Pilgrim edition have collected, reveal a man of astonishing energies who attempted to impose an artist's vision of order on every aspect of his life and work. In the late essays, Dickens emerges as a restless, poetic wanderer who masterfully blends observation, autobiography, and allegory. Much of this prose is valuable as a window on the novelist's attitudes and preoccupations, but most of it stands on its own, the work of an acute observer and dedicated craftsman. Dickens started a periodical publication he called Household Words in the 1850s and was urged by its printers to begin writing a new weekly serial when the sales had been falling for some time. One reason among many for writing the story that would be known as Hard Times for these times, which is the full title, was therefore an attempt to increase the sales of household words, an endeavor that succeeded very well. The novel has been recognized as Dickens's distinctive attempt to come to grips with the phenomenon of the industrial city, which represents what he feels is wrong, the self-interest among people taking over, that the gap between rich and poor widens, and the employed laborer lose their individualization in the eyes of factory owners and are exploited at the expense of profit. Hard Times has also been described as a novel that asks most clearly to be read not as a mere fictional world, but as a commentary on a contemporary crisis. It is, after all, Hard Times for these times, and it is dedicated to Thomas Carlyle, the social thinker whose vision of a society of human connection influenced Dickens so profoundly in the 1840s and 1850s. The novel is therefore not only supposed to be a pleasant and entertaining read, it is a work of fiction which contains a serious depth and has an underlying gravity which is important to be aware of. It is both a criticism of industrialism and an attempt to raise awareness among people about how they think. The novel takes place somewhere in England during the mid-19th century and involves many different and sometimes profoundly distinct characters, especially concerning their conduct towards others, and in particular those of a different class or disposition. To begin with, we are introduced to the Gradgrind family and the two oldest children. Their father, Mr. Gradgrind, also happens to be the founder of the school they attend, an arena in which he greatly enjoys sharing his philosophy about rationality and facts. He believes strongly in practical and logical notions and does not approve of imaginative and illogical thinking and reasoning, neither by his children nor by his ward, Cecilia Zoop. Zoop is the daughter of a circus entertainer who disappeared and left her to be taken in by Gradgrind. Mr. Gradgrind, despite his friend Mr. Bounderby's objection for doing so, believes he may have a chance of putting her straight. Zoop is specifically very different from the Gradgrind children, that is to say, their complete opposite, and that is something Mr. Gradgrind wishes to amend. Time passes and the Gradgrind children becomes older. They mature into adulthood according to their father's efforts and wish, and all the while their experience of their own life seems to them as if something is missing, something vital. Tom shows an increasingly self-interested side. He inconsiderately gambles too much and starts to owe people a lot of money. His everyday goal is mainly to enjoy himself as much as possible. Louisa, on other hand, is married to the factory owner, Mr. Bounderby, who is much older than her. She finds herself trapped in this marriage at the same time as her brother becomes an apprentice at her husband's bank. During all of this, Cecilia Jupe stays at the Gradgrind home and takes care of the younger children and the household. One day, Mr. Bounderby's bank is robbed and no witnesses can be found except someone claiming that the low-status workers that do the dirtiest work in the city's factories had been observing the building many nights in a row before the robbery happened. While the robbery remains a mystery, Louisa suffers from distress and feels miserable in her marriage with Mr. Bounderby, who she does not love. She meets a certain Mr. Hurthouse and experiences emotions her upbringing has quenched and now take her by surprise. Uncertain and confused, she leaves her husband and lives at a stone lodge once more, her childhood home. This makes Mr. Bounderby furious. Mr. Gradgrind and Louisa ultimately understand that Tom is the bank robber. With a little help from Sleary and his circus performers, with whom Cecilia Jupe spent her early childhood, they manage to help Tom leaves the country and be spared his penalty. Meanwhile, the snooty character of Mrs. Sparsit makes an appearance. She is employed as Mr. Bounderby's housekeeper and wishes to be the one her employer will marry. In her attempt to help Mr. Bounderby find the bank robber and win his favor, she presents a certain Mrs. Pegler, who she believes has something to do with the bank robbery. Old Mrs. Pegler is then revealed to be Mr. Bounderby's mother and a woman who loves her son. She would never abandon him, as he had always proclaimed she did. Mr. Bounderby's rise from rags to riches has all been a lie, and he loses face. He had forbidden his mother to visit him and fires Mrs. Sparsit for putting him in this position. The story ends with a glimpses into the future, where Mr. Bounderby dies alone in Corktown and Mr. Gradgrind abandons his fact-oriented and rational philosophy to help poor people instead. Cecilia Jupe, on the other hand, marries and lives a happy life with her own family, while Lucia never will have one of her own. Still, their relationship is strong, and Jupe teaches Lucia the importance of feeling sympathy for her fellow men and women. Her brother Tom also at last understands his faults, but unfortunately dies without ever seeing his family again. There are several different settings described in the novel, and they all contribute to our understanding of time in one way or another. The town of Corktown is where the main part of the story is set and bears a name that implies the many factories therein driven by coke. Because of this large-scale industry, the intense pollution turns the town into a very filthy place. It was a town of red bricks that would have been red if smoke and ashes had allowed it. And in the hardest part of the Cork town, in the innermost fortification of that ugly circle, nature was as strongly bricked out as killing airs and gases were bricked in. The town is seemingly the worst place to live. It is ugly, unhealthy, and a prison that nature cannot enter. The environment is thus heavily industrialized and is moreover described in the novel as a place where time went on like its own machinery. The pollution and one-sidedness of life and work portrayed in Corktown together convey gloomy monotony. It contained several large streets, all very like one another, and many small streets still more like one another, inhabited by people equally like one another, who all went in and out at the same hours with the same work, and to whom every day was the same as yesterday and tomorrow, and every year the counterpart of the last and the next. When presenting Corktown in this manner, the author makes any reader's assumption that healthy creativity and variation exist in this place completely impossible. The town already runs like clockwork. The environment is, in other words, mechanized, almost as if in passing, and express something close to sadness and hopelessness. Throughout the novel, similar descriptions are attributed to Corktown and various houses and locations as well. Stone Lodge, for instance, where the family Gradgrind resides, is given an portrayal. Life at Stone Lodge went monotonously round like a piece of machinery which discouraged human interference. Even the very name Stone Lodge denotes the place not to be much different from a stone cave or a stone hut with damp mortar and a cold and somber ambience. Everything about the Gradgrind home is highly functional and ordered, and around the house there is a lawn and garden and an infant avenue, all ruled straight like a botanical account book. However, when Cecilia and a character called Rachel go outside the city, the novel offers the first view of an environment very different from the filthy and noisy setting which has been dominating the novel up to the point. When they leave the town behind with its many smoke pillars and monotonous and lifeless work, it is almost as if another world has opened its doors to them. Lucia and Rachel have wandered straight into a country of fresh green grass with birds singing in the air, and at the horizon, the glittering light of faraway sea is visible. The atmosphere has completely changed, and the mechanical features in the novel seem not to be present anymore. However, the almost blissful and idyllic green landscape Rachel and Lucia have entered into is still underscored by the presence of contrasting mechanical feature in the shape of old coal pits and abandoned mining equipments scattered all over. For a brief moment, the novel shows how different life in Corktown is from the rest of the world, outside its boundaries. Here, time is not with any mechanical tools or surrounded and driven by unreflecting repetitiveness, at least to a lesser degree, but has changed into something free and natural. The words without the shocks and noises of another times emphasizes the presence of nature and the existence of its own system for measuring time, or rather that outside Corktown's noisy atmosphere, time in a sense is smoother and is experienced the way time should be according to the message of the novel. Here time is more alive than in the poisonous town, where monotony rules and independent diversities of any kind are disliked. The mechanical atmosphere of the Corktown setting is also embodied in the clocks among the identical sooty red bricked building and the monotonous work of the hands at the factories. Clocks symbolize the mechanical understanding of the time most clearly in the novel by measuring it with complete dull monotony and without any reflection or life other than what they are given by the manufacturers. In the novel, we find such a clock in the possession of Mr. Gradgrind and situated in his apartment where he does his work. A stern room with a deadly statistical clock in it, which measured every second with a beat like a rap upon a coffin lid. Mr. Gradgrind's clock stresses the fact that we have only a certain amount of time before passing away, and gives emphasis to the thought that this time length is already measured and now simply needs to be deducted. Everything from the clocks mentioned now and then in the novel to the contrast in the places the characters live and work affect the time perception in the next. It becomes clear that Corktown represents the mechanical perspective, whereas the outskirts, along with the traveling circus, represent the natural perspective. Within these different settings, we also find different characters that are connected to the mechanical or natural environments they are in. Mr. Bounderby represents an insensible and mechanical way of thinking in the novel and exemplifies it frequently. One occasion when it is evident that his self-interest restrains him from feeling empathy from other people in their hardship comes about when he receives Stephen Blackpool and is asked for advice concerning an unhappy marriage. So Mr. Blackpool is married to a woman who is an alcoholic, who does not work and who steals and sells his possessions. Irrespective of the fact that it was an expensive and complicated undertaking to enable a divorce at that time, and that Blackpool, who is only a poor worker with no prospect of ever saving up the amount of money required, Mr. Bounderby has no interest in helping him. Mr. Bounderby sees nothing to gain from helping Blackpool, who therefore only receives uncaring talk from his employer. It is not only the narrator who mechanizes the characters in hard times by description and choices of words or presentation of their person. Some characters mechanize other characters as well. Bounderby is such a character who regards people around him as either resources he may make use of or opportunities he cannot make use of himself, and therefore dismisses them. An example of this mechanization of character by characters is when Mr. Bounderby says to Stephen Blackpool, "You are a steady hand, and I was not mistaken." By this declaration, it is evident that he is regarding Blackpool as merely a hand and therefore addresses and treats him as one. Mr. Bounderby reduces him into a tool and not a person with feelings and other attributes of a human being, and does so simply by speaking to Blackpool and all his other workers in this manner. To illustrate this mechanical and hence non-emotional characteristic of Mr. Bounderby further, we might consider the underlying meaning in his declaration that I am not going to take him at once. He is to finish his educational cramming before then. Thus, Mr. Bounderby does not intend to employ young Thomas Gradgrind until he is crammed with fact. Since he understands education to be cramming facts, he also judges people value to himself as a resources according to how much they know, as when he is watching Mrs. Spassett contemplatively, Mrs. Bounderby was obliged to get up from table and stand with his back to the fire looking at her. She was such an enhancement of his position. Therefore, it should be asserted that Mr. Bounderby does not only consider the amount of money someone has or earned, but also how extensive his or her knowledge is as a sufficient criteria to grade the value of a person, and in the prolongation his own life as well, that is, the time he spends while alive. As mentioned before, our concept of the world is dependent on the dominating perception of man and the society we live in. Our world conception also concentrates our apprehension of space and time, moral principles, work, etc., and provide us with an understanding of the world we live in. To human beings, the awareness of time may differ in their experiences of it, and therefore they may not share the same understanding or value of it either. In the novel, Mr. Bounderby illustrates this difference when he visits Sleary's horsemanship and addresses Mr. Childers when saying, "You see, my friend," Mr. Bounderby put in, "we are the kind of people who know the value of time, and you are the kind of people who don't know the value of time." Mr. Childers then replies that if Mr. Bounderby means that he can make more money out of his time than himself, judging from the way he is dressed, then he must be right. The character of Mr. Bounderby is plainly the personification of the mechanical system upon which Coketown is built, and also later on in the novel, the living proof of its failure as well. He speaks of himself as Mr. Bounderby of Coketown, boast to everyone of the unfairness and struggles he went through in his childhood and youth, and throughout the novel we understand him to cherish his conviction that everyone could be a self-made man as himself if they could only put their mind to it. However, toward the end of the novel, he is discovered to be a fraud and liar when it is revealed that during his childhood he was very much loved, taken care of, and never beaten and bullied about, as he had always proclaimed. Mrs. Pegler, who is brought to confront Mr. Bounderby for suspicion of having something to do with the bank robbery, is the one who brings out the story. She tells the gathered listeners that she is in fact Mr. Bounderby's mother, and that, my dear boy knows and will give you to know that though he come of humble parents, he come of parents that loved him as dear as the best could. Mr. Bounderby is thus deprived of his pride in having a childhood of a struggle against all odds, through which he became who he is today. Through this, Dickens insinuates that mechanical self-interest and an exclusive striving for economic profit, which Mr. Bounderby is clearly professing, is not the sole prerequisite to become successful and a self-made man. Josiah Bounderby's success and philosophy do not agree with his true upbringing, and therefore puts his preaching in question. To sum up, it is apparent that Mr. Bounderby does not regard people in his vicinity as individuals. Rather, they become a means of enhancing his own social and economical power and influence. When a mechanical point of view is applied to a degree, such as in Mr. Bounderby, it dehumanizes other people, and he does not see the hands as human but worker or expendable assets that can be easily replaced. With this, I conclude the lecture today, and we shall meet in another lecture having the discussion telling about the Victorian society, Victorian literature as a whole. Thank you very much.